This is Cannaramic, and we're bringing you cannabis like you've never seen it before.
Today, we're excited to have Sasha Simon from the Drug Policy Alliance talking with us about the wonderful work she's doing with high school students and about the issues of teenage and underage usage of drugs and what the DPA is doing in this regard. So I'm excited to have you. This is a burning issue for many, many people. Thank you for being here.
I'm happy to be here. So as you said, I'm Sasha Simon. I'm the Safety First Program Manager at the Drug Policy Alliance. And Safety First is a harm reduction-based drug education curriculum. So let me break down what that means. Most people, when they went to high school or they went to middle school and possibly when they were even in elementary school, they received some type of drug education. It could have been DARE. That's the most popular drug education model in the US. And all of those models are abstinence-based, meaning the idea is that you're never gonna do drugs for the rest of your life. And so long as you pledge allegiance to never doing drugs, it's gonna remain that way for the rest of your life. And as you see, that's just simply not the case. Accidental overdose is the #1 cause of death for folks under 50 in the US. It's actually lowered the life expectancy rate in the US.
Wow.
So we're not abstaining from drugs, we're actually doing them, but we're not doing them in a way that's healthy. We're not regulating them. We're not regulating the use or even the possession in a way that's healthy. We're locking folks up. We're criminalizing the use and possession of cannabis especially, and we're really not doing ourselves any good. So Safety First is really comprehensive and actually follows the model of comprehensive sexual health education, which understands that if you give young people the tools and the skills that they need to be able to make healthy decisions, they're actually more likely to do so, right?
Wow.
So, yeah, so with sex ed, right? If you teach them how to use a condom, the different forms of contraception, birth control, how to use it, where to find it, they're more likely to seek those things out when they actually decide to have sex, right? They're actually more likely to wait to have sex too. Okay. And so we think that the same thing can be true with drug education. So we modeled Safety First behind that. We talk about what a drug is, how drugs work in the body, and then we get into all the different drug classes. Okay. And cannabis is actually one of those topics that we have 2 lessons on.
All right, well, I want to get into the deeply. You got to break apart a lot of what you said because there's a lot to unpack there. Now, before we get into that, how did you come into this? Because this is kind of not a typical path, and it's something that, you know, is so necessary in our society. How did the program come about, and what did you need to do to formulate the program?
That's a great question. And so I've been with DPA about 2 years now. And prior to that, I was working as a health educator in New York City schools. I had been doing a lot of teaching. I've done a lot of after-school programming, youth development. And I felt like I understood a whole lot around health education. New York has, of course, a really robust health education system. And I was approached by DPA because they actually have had the Safety First program for a while. It started as a pamphlet that was created by Marsha Rosenbaum. And that pamphlet was a how-to guide for parents and that gave instruction on how to talk to their teens about drugs responsibly, without stigma, without judgment. And she wanted to find a way to make that work sustainable. And so she, as well as Stephanie Jones, who is also the person who brought me into this work at DPA, had the idea to make this work sustainable by creating a curriculum that could be taught in high school classes by high school teachers.
Wow, wow.
So that's when they came looking for someone, and we got in touch with each other. And when they told me the idea, I was blown away because, again, as a health educator, I thought that, you know, our field was doing everything we could to really properly provide young people with the information that they need. And what I found out is we have completely dropped the ball when it comes to substance. I mean, completely dropped the ball.
So they've got a lot going on with teenage abstinence or sex education, but substance abuse education and drug education, you're saying there wasn't enough there.
Well, there's a lot of work that's being done there. Let me be very clear, but it's also not realistic. Safety first is reality based, right? Because the predominant models are begging for young people to abstain and to never do drugs for the rest of their lives. And, you know, I wouldn't necessarily be against that, but just the reality is that people don't. Just like people don't not have sex for the rest of their lives either, right? And so we have to just accept the reality that we are a nation of folks who actually use and consume drugs. But how are we gonna keep each other safe? How are we gonna make sure we know how to respond to emergencies? How do we make sure we responsibly consume these substances? We haven't given each other the space to be able to talk about that. And that's where I think we've really been failing.
So what were you seeing in New York City schools in health education? And were you coming across a lot of drug use amongst students, and what type of situations were you seeing?
Well, when it comes to health education in New York, well, one of the really great things is, one, it's mandated in the state. The whole state, you have to take at least one semester of health education to graduate from high school, and I think that's great. And one of the things that they did is they actually updated health education law back in 2015 so that teachers must provide some type of instruction around opioid use and misuse, which I think is also great. So I just want to be clear that New York is actually very progressive, but we have a very cultural attitude around, you know, this abstinence-only education model. So what I was seeing in high schools is that information about drugs was pretty minimal. It's typically just around tobacco and alcohol, which alcohol is the most widely used drug among young people. But you know, young people also consume cannabis. I know young people vape. That is the thing. Vaping is the thing. And it's important that they know how these mechanisms work. It's important that they know how any kind of drug they can ever be introduced to at any point of their life can affect their brains and their bodies. And what I've seen with drug education so far is that there's a lot of talk about the risks, a little talk about the science, a lot of talk about the risks, and here's why you shouldn't do it, but we're still doing it. It hasn't been convincing.
Right. So the DPA overall, the organization, is focused on providing advocacy and policies towards policies that regulate drugs in that are grounded in science and compassion and health and human rights. So let's create smart, compassionate drug policy. And one of the biggest pushes for the DPA now is the marijuana legalization for adult use on a national level. Now, what impact will passage of this type of legislation have on those under 21, those that are not adults? So what should we expect to see when it happens, and what impact do you think it'll have on those who are under 21?
Well, the biggest thing and the most exciting thing for me is that there will be less criminalization of folks under 21 under legalization. Decriminalization in New York specifically has not been enough. Stop and Frisk had over 800,000 arrests, most of those being young Black and brown men. And that's still the case. Even though Stop and Frisk has since been abolished over the years, we still see that Black and brown men are being overly policed, even though we're seeing a reduction in stops. So with the legalization, there becomes an even greater opportunity for there to be less criminalization of young people in our communities. And I think that's one of the biggest things, because once they're criminalized young, that impacts their opportunity to be able to get housing, employment, education. And so that's something that I think that we need to stop full scale. In addition, if you have legalization, now you have the regulation of the substance, which I think is good, right? One of the things we talk about in the curriculum is that exactly, right? We talk about drug policy a little bit, and what does it mean to regulate drugs, right? At least, regardless of what your feelings are around drug use, and regardless of what drug that is, at least you know that if there's a space where it's regulated, you or a loved one or anyone else can be able to access that. Know that your young one that's 21 or younger cannot access that, because dispensaries are tight. They are very tight on ID. And I think just overall, it just keeps young people safe, because they're already accessing cannabis pretty freely. In fact, more than 80% of young people say they already have easy access to cannabis. So they already have access. I prefer that they still won't have access because they still got to be 21. But I at least prefer that there be some type of regulated sale and trade. So we know that there's products that we can rely on. We know that there's instructional and dosage usage that make sure that whoever comes into contact knows not to consume too much of this. You know, sometimes people, especially young people, get a hold of edibles and they have no idea how much they need to consume or not. And they find out the hard way many times.
Right.
But with regulation, there becomes the inherent need for education. And so people understand why we would want young folks to wait until 21. And if young folks don't, which many will not, at least they know what to do when they do come into contact with cannabis.
So is there a thought that the increased visibility might, promote the usage of cannabis?
Like I said, more than 80% of teenagers already say they have easy access to it. So it's already visible, and we have to be real about that.
Okay, so in other states that have legalized adult use, what have we seen in terms of the usage by people under 21? Is it the same? Is it increased in other states where you see adult use has been legalized?
You haven't seen any rise in states where it's been legalized. In fact, in Colorado and Washington, you've seen cannabis use among youth decline a little bit. So you haven't seen any rise at all. And so I know people get spooked about that, but it hasn't become a reality at all.
Okay, so we were talking about abstinence and the abstinence mantra. You know, they abstain from sex and abstain from just say no to drugs. How effective have those campaigns been in terms of drug use, minimizing or decreasing drug use in our country?
I mean, they really haven't been. One of the things we did get really good about was tobacco cessation. So there's a lot less people smoking cigarettes. So there is some merit to, you know, strictly fact-based, don't do it type of messaging. And there's no harm in presenting to a young person that abstinence is an option, and you can take that. And you can take that not just as a young person. People abstain at all different types of, all different points of their life, and they should always feel welcome to do so, right? But the reality is that more than half of teenagers have tried a drug by the time that they graduate. So it's not working, it's not effective.
Right, right. So harm reduction, that's a term you use, and it's different from abstinence. How do we see that specific, how does that play out specifically in the curriculum when you're talking about harm reduction versus an abstinence message?
So harm reduction is an approach. It's the idea that you're using a set of strategies that will help reduce the harms of whatever activity you're engaged in, right? And there's a lot of different ways that harm reduction looks. And in fact, we talk about that and break that down in a way that it can be, that young people can really get it. For example, a football helmet is a form of harm reduction, right? A seatbelt is a form of harm reduction. Riding in a car is risky, right? So putting on a seatbelt helps reduce the harm to you getting hurt if you decide to engage in that activity. So we perform harm reduction all the time, right?
That makes sense. As opposed to saying don't play football or don't ride in a car. It's when you ride in a car, when you play football, put a helmet on your head. Got it. See, exactly. It's easy enough, even I can understand it.
Exactly.
Okay. So you rolled out the program last year at Bard High School in New York City. There were about 40 students, you said, in the program?
Double that, about 88.
There were 80 something students. How receptive was the school administration and the parent community to this program?
I mean, we were very fortunate that they were so open and supportive. They understood it. They understood the purpose behind this. And they were happy to be able to give us space to be able to implement this for their students. And what was also really cool, I got to meet with their PTA twice. And, you know, they would come to me with questions as they should. And I really enjoyed that. But one of the main questions I always get is, how do I get this information? right? As a parent, how do I get this information? How do I give it to my child that's at a different school? Because the thing is, we've been doing this abstinence only thing for so long that we have a whole generation of adults that don't really know much either, right? And that's what you become hip to once you realize that's what your young person is now learning about. Like, I don't really know too much either, right?
Wow. And that's part of the reason probably we try to keep our kids away from drugs, and we don't have those conversations. We don't know, and we don't want them to know that we don't know, because, you know, we feel like that makes them more vulnerable. So Safety First is all about focusing on education. What is your response to parents who may be afraid for their children to be exposed to drug education? They may feel that, you know, what if it makes them want to experiment more? What is your response to parents who have that concern?
Well, the thing is, life is long, and I understand that, you know, parents are usually worried about keeping their young person safe because it is a vulnerable time. They're still developing. You know, a lot of talk about the developing brain is always, you know, brought up when we talk about cannabis. But the reality is young people ideally will grow up. They'll become adults. They'll move around in the world. They'll have new experiences, and they may come in contact with that substance. And I want them to know what to do. And even if they don't come into contact with that substance, they may come into contact with somebody else who's using that substance, right? They may be in a place where there's a substance-related emergency. Do they know how to respond, right? Those things are also really important for a young person to know. So it's not all about just drug use. A lot of it is around drug policy, how to respond to an emergency. You need to know that. There's a lot of people who don't know that you can call 911 in a drug-related incident and save someone's life. I've gotten phone calls from parents, in fact, whose child died because they were experimenting with their friends and their friends were too scared to call 911. So what I would say to a parent, and I know it's hard to take, but you don't want your child to be in that position. And education gives them the ability to not be in that position.
Wow, that is powerful. So, you know, the worry about experimentation, you know, it's not just about that. It's about giving them the power and empowering them in the world to be able to respond and to be in these situations in the world. I think you had mentioned that some of the students felt that they appreciated being spoken to in a mature manner around this conversation. You know, what type of responses were you getting from the students?
They appreciated having the space and the structure to be able to really explore, to be able to ask questions of their teacher, because again, there's not a lot of opportunities for these kinds of conversations to be modeled. And so they really, what I've seen is that students tend to appreciate their teachers a lot more, and it tends to really open up some rapport between them, students and teachers. But also what is interesting to realize is that if young people are gonna do drugs, they're most likely gonna do drugs with each other, right? It's not gonna be some random person, it's gonna be their peers. So it's a really incredible experience that they're learning about drugs and how to keep each other safe with each other. So they're already getting into the habit of that. Hopefully that carries outside of the classroom.
Wow, that's so, I mean, it's just so novel, but so simple to get it. It just makes so much sense for this type of setting to be made for students and young people to learn and to converse. Because a lot of times they're having conversations with people and it's based upon rumors, it's based upon, you know, information that they've gotten off the internet or things like that. And they're just not being educated and no one is talking to them about it. So they just go by what they heard. So what are some of the fundamentals that Safety First is teaching? You know, what are kids going to get when they're in the program?
Well, one of the key fundamentals that they're learning from Safety First is one that they already have to learn while they're in school, and that's how to evaluate sources, and particularly online sources. So anytime young people, and I mean people of any age, but anytime someone really wants to find out information about a drug, especially an illicit one, they go online. You might read a thread of a Reddit blog, and you know that's where you're taking in your information. But how credible is that, right? What authority does that person really have to say this or that about that drug? So one of the things that we introduce in the curriculum is what's called the CRAP test, which takes a look at how credible and reliable and what is the authority of that person that wrote that piece. You know, who are they trying to appeal to? What is their audience? What's their purpose? What's their agenda? So they practice actually looking for information. They utilize the CRAP test to see how credible of a source that is. And then they can, what they really get from that is, okay, everybody has their own agenda online, right? Everybody's coming from a certain place, but let me at least make sure I'm cognizant of where I'm getting my facts from.
I love that. Yeah, I love that because, like, you know, my kid is always regurgitating something he read online. First of all, he doesn't remember where he got it from. So was it a book, or was it online, or was it on TV? You know, and then it's like, well, that's crap. First of all, where did you get that? And, you know, it's just constantly, I think that this generation definitely has a lot of work to do in that regard, learning how to understand what the information is that they're getting, because there's so much of it, and discerning how to use that information. So I love. Now, you guys also do, what other things you do? The fundamental stuff.
I mean, we also really grounded in, you know, defining what is a drug, right? So in terms of drugs, we don't just talk about the illicit ones, or, you know, ones that are, there's a debate around legalization. We also talk about dose and dosage, right? So you might receive prescription drugs, right? Or a prescription from your doctor, and you need to understand how to take those, right? How to dose that. And so from the very, very beginning of the curriculum, we ask kids, what is a drug, right? So the teacher gets an idea of how it is that they conceptualize what drugs are. And then we also have our own definition in the curriculum, that is any drug or any substance that in small amounts makes changes to the body or the brain or both. So that really expands the definition, so that they consider things like caffeine is a drug, right? Sugar is a drug. We can start to develop physical dependencies on those things, and they can start to change our body chemistry and how we think. So it gives a more holistic idea for a young person to consider how it is that they're putting things into their body, what it is that they're consuming on. Yeah.
That's really interesting, because I actually had a debate with my son the other day about alcohol, and the whole idea that alcohol is a drug. And the first thing he said, well, alcohol is not a drug. So this understanding, this fundamental understanding of these concepts are so critical for people coming up, and just to empower them with this information is really going to equip them for the future. So I'm excited for Safety First. Now, you guys cover a multidisciplinary and multimodal approach, right? So drug education from a variety of subject matters. So you do science, you do math, you incorporate the history, and then you have lecture format, you have group discussions, you have hands-on activities. Give me an example of a typical kind of lesson, like a hands-on type of thing that they would do.
A really fun hands-on activity that young people like is when we introduce the concept of drug checking or drug adulteration, meaning that your whatever drug you're taking, or even your drink, could be mixed with something that you don't know, right? And so what the teacher does ahead of time is they have two clear pitchers. They both have red Kool-Aid in them. One has sugar in it, one has salt in it. And then the teacher gives the instruction to guess which one they think has sugar in it. So of course, students get excited. They have their cup, they wait in line for their cup, they get their cup, they pour it in, they taste it, they see if it's sweet or if it's salty. And, you know, somebody always gets it wrong in the classroom. But just through going through that simple exercise, it's a very visceral experience of, you know what, I really don't know what's in that. I really don't always know what's in the things that I consume. And so then it allows for them to have a greater conversation around, well, be careful, because you don't always know, especially if it's illegal. You don't always know what's included in it. And especially if you're in a situation where you don't know folks, you don't always know what they put in your drink or your Jello shot or whatever. You don't know these people, you don't know. So
I love that. Oh my God, we need to do that for adults too. I mean, It's funny because you mentioned earlier how most of us have come up in this, you know, just say no generation. None of us got this education. This is like important. I mean, grown people are going in and they're getting caught out there in clubs and in bars with, you know, people putting things in their drinks and things of that nature. So, this is good. Okay. So what is the feedback from the students who participated in this study? I mean, do you have any data yet showing like if there's been an increase or a decrease of experimentation with these students?
Well, one of the things that makes us really happy is that they definitely have an increase in their harm reduction knowledge. So they understand more what harm reduction is. They know they can report what harm reduction strategies they remember from the curriculum. They also were more likely to report that they would call 911 if they saw that someone was overdosing, right? If there was an emergency. They understand that abstinence is still an option at all times. In fact, when I would do post interviews with students after they had the curriculum, they would say to me, you know, I really don't want to do drugs. I'm not interested in that. But if my friend had problematic use or someone I cared about had problematic use, I want to make sure that whatever policies are in place actually takes care of them as opposed to penalizing them, as opposed to being punitive, because that doesn't help.
Right.
That doesn't help. And you know, what's also interesting about all of this is these kids don't have any concept of, you know, abstinence-based drug education, right? That's a concept that we have because that's what we went through. And so once they go through a more comprehensive harm reduction-based model, it just makes sense to them. It clicks to them. They're not any more interested in experimenting, but they feel a lot more informed. They're very grateful that they have the opportunity to have those conversations with their teachers and that their teachers would create that kind of safe space for them. So they're grateful to be entrusted with the information, and they're also grateful to be empowered to be a hero and to use that information if they ever need to. It's not just information about drugs, it's also how do you keep people around you safe as well, not just yourself. And so that's something we got to get into the habit of speaking about, not just our own individual consumption.
Right. As parents, you know, we're like, oh, I don't want my kids to use drugs. But like you said before, you know, our kids could be in a position where they need to help a friend who's having an overdose or a problem. And I just love the idea of being able to empower them with the knowledge so that when they're in those environments, they have the equipment, they have the words, they have the way to communicate as to whether or not they want to participate, right? They don't feel weird about it. They can just kind of deal with it and understand how to manage that scenario. So I love this. So when will Safety First be available, and how will all the school districts around the world, because everybody in the world needs this, how will they get it?
I agree. Everybody needs it. It'll be available late summer, so in time for the 2019 to 2020 school year. Right now, we're looking at late August. It'll be available for free online, so anyone can download it, anyone can use it. It's meant for high school teachers in their classrooms, but you know, I've had parents who are like, oh, you're teaching my kid this. How do I learn this too? So I'd recommend it for anyone, especially high school age and up. It's a really good look. So we're looking forward to August as the release.
I am excited. I'm going to get it for me and my family. And even if we have to have like a little family reunion with all the kids, we'll do that. Because we can't rely upon our schools to want to pick up a program, but we have to empower our students and our children. It's so vital, the work you're doing. It gives me so much joy to know that this resource is out there for parents and for young adults. And you must be so excited to be a part of this as well. So we're rooting for you. We're going to be promoting it everywhere. And we thank you so much for sharing this information with us here at the Cannaramic Online Summit. We know you've given us cannabis in a way we've never seen it before. Thank you so much, my friend Sasha Simon.